Dr.
hmm
Swantek specializes in the fields of archaeology and anthropology, specializing in studying how societies became more complex during the prehistoric Bronze Age in Cyprus. Additionally, she holds a role as the co-director of the Kourion Urban Space Project, an ongoing archaeological field project. This project aims to investigate the relationship between natural disasters and social transformations by conducting excavations in the city from 4th century AD, which is located on the southern coast of Cyprus. And I'm sure Dr. Swantek, Laura, if I may, will
hmm
tell us a lot more about that. So, welcome to the History of Cyprus podcast, Laura.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here.
So, just to start off, can you just tell me a little bit about the Korean Urban Space Project, or KUSP?
Sure. So KUSP began about 11 or so years ago. It's turned into a very big project with lots of collaborators. So it is mainly headed by Dr. Tom Davis, who's at the Lanier Center for Archaeology at Lipscomb University. Dr. Chris Davey works along with us with spatial technologies, and he is at the Australian Institute of Archaeology. We've worked closely with the Cyprus University of Technology, the University of Cyprus, and of course, the Department of Antiquities, who we can't do anything without them, right? They give us the permission. And then when we run into major problems, they're the ones that help us. And so I started on CUSP at the very, very beginning, and I was a grad student at the time. I've since transitioned to a teaching and research role at Phoenix College. And so that's an affiliate of our project as well now. And so we started with this idea that we were going to try to understand, as you said, like the social transformation that happens after the 4th century or the mid 4th century CE earthquakes. We know that a series of earthquakes hit the Eastern Mediterranean around that time. They're called earthquake storms. So that means you get a lot of like small earthquakes that are happening in a short amount of time, and then you get some really big ones. And we know that a really big one hit Kourion. And so when Kourion is hit by this earthquake, it's destroyed. And then what happens, right? So, what happens when a giant natural disaster happens and the slate is basically wiped clean because the city is destroyed? And so, we're looking at how the space is being used, how the urban space changes after that earthquake, but also about how how are people thinking about things? How are they going about their lives? What social transitions are also happening? And so it's a big thing, right? Like to use the urban space to kind of tell us what people are thinking about, how they're living their lives, and how these big natural disasters affect them. There's a lot of ethnographic research on this kind of stuff where you go and ask people, which is obviously like a lot easier. You get a lot of really good information, but we don't have that, right? We're dealing with populations who are long gone, and so we have to use the archaeological remains, the material remains that they've left behind, and their how they structured their city to tell us anything about this. So we're really looking at like how does the city evolve over time? What is its life cycle? How did the neighborhoods change? We're looking at elite versus non-elite because we have both kind of households represented on on the Kourion promontory where the city is. And so how is this all coming to play after these 4th century earthquakes? Another really interesting thing about Kourion is that it's a city without a water source. And so I remember when I was a young archaeologist, one of the things that was like constantly drilled into my head is that there's not going to be a site if there's not a water source, because people obviously need water, right? And a
Hmm.
giant city, yeah, right? Like this is like fundamental to who we are.
Yeah.
And so a giant city in urban space without a natural water source is actually really, really rare. And so we know that water was being pumped in from the hills that are north of Kourion. And we know that catastrophic earthquakes, especially the one of the mid 4th century, will take out a water system. And so we know that the water conduit was damaged and that affected the rebuilding of the city. So we're also looking at that water system, trying to understand it better, and trying to understand the role it played in how the city was rebuilt. And then on top of that, disaster archaeology is its own field. And so I never set out to be a disaster archaeologist. It's funny how things happen, right? But now this is my second earthquake site. So I'm just giving into the fact that maybe this is who I am, right? And the thing that I study. And so we want to make some kind of contribution to disaster archaeology and really understand how archaeological sites form due to natural disasters, right? There are just natural formation processes that happen that turn living sites into archaeological sites, and those are going to be different for disaster sites. And so we're trying to really understand how this happens and what it looks like, and document it as best we can so that we can make a contribution to disaster archaeology in general. So those are like the big research questions of KUSP. And so we set out with different questions at the beginning. And as all good research, as this happens with all good research, right, you have to change your research questions with the data that you're collecting, right? Because we really thought that we were going to do a very, very deep study of elite versus non-elite households in Kourion, in the city, and that is not actually what happened. So we ended on kind of the research questions that I just described, but we've been fortunate that we've excavated in what's called the earthquake house. It's been excavated multiple times. Most extensively in the 1980s by David Soren and his team out of the University of Arizona. And we sort of picked up where they kind of left off and learned some new things and added to what they already knew. And so that is a non-elite structure. So we do have those data. We did work in that context. But our big focus of excavation now is what we call Building 4, which is just kind of to the south of the earthquake house. And at least at one point in the life of this building, it was an incredible elite structure. So this is another thing. My personal research is really based on wealth inequality. And so I like this kind of stuff, but I've always focused on regular people in their households. And now I find myself excavating this just unbelievably rich building, which is not something I ever saw myself doing. So, I guess that's a little bit of a lesson to young archaeologists. What you expect that you'll do is probably not it. So you have to be really malleable.
That
But
sounds
so,
great. That sounds
right,
so
like,
fascinating to me.
yeah, so and I've enjoyed it, right? Because now I'm learning new things and I'm looking at things from a different perspective. I look at archaeological sites from a prehistoric perspective, and I work with people who look at them from the historic perspective. And so we're constantly doing this back and forth of, well, the historical sources say, and I'm like, yeah, but what does the archaeology tell you, right? And so that becomes a very interesting conversation, and I think that all archaeological projects should have people who work on both sets of time periods because you get a fuller perspective. So anyway, so that's generally what we're doing at Kourion right now. Dr. Chris Davey has also done this amazing survey of the all of Kourion really, and mapped all of it, and it is spectacular. So if nothing else, we've made a giant contribution just by mapping a site that we didn't have a complete map of before.
So, okay, so for those who might not be familiar with Kourion as an historical site, can you share with listeners a little bit about the city, like what we know about its age, the site in historical sources, if you have that information? Is there anything you can just give some context to listeners where it's located, that sort of stuff?
Sure, absolutely. So Kourion is actually located on the south coast of Cyprus. It is west of Limassol and east of Paphos. It is in the area of Episcopi Village, and technically it's on the British military base. The city itself is on a limestone outcrop or promontory or acropolis. People use all different words for that. And it overlooks the Mediterranean Sea. And so whenever I show pictures of people or to people of where I work, they're like, "Oh, you spend your summer looking at the Mediterranean? Poor you," right? Like, I realize I'm very lucky, right? I have this
Yeah.
amazing view all
It's a
summer
beautiful
long.
sight. It's a beautiful sight.
Oh, it is spectacular. And so we have all these limestone cliffs, right? Kourion is on top of it. There's beautiful sandy beach. In my opinion, the best beach on Cyprus is right below the site. Um, but we know that that area has been inhabited from at least the Neolithic. So we have, ephemeral, but some evidence of a really early occupation in that area. While the city itself doesn't have a direct water source like into the city, if you just kind of go downhill from that limestone outcrop, you're going to hit the Chorus River. And that river is extremely important in or for southern Cyprus from the Neolithic on, right? This is what's keeping everybody alive. And it's also the source of like raw material, like stone for tools. So we know that at least by the Neolithic, people are there. If you go just north of Kourion, you're going to hit a very small village called Satira. In that village is Satira Tepes, which is a ceramic Neolithic site. Just below that site is the early Bronze Age site, Satira Kamenutia. That's a site that I work on, that I trained on actually as an undergraduate. And then we know that there were cities in that area during the late Bronze Age. We have Episcopi Phaneromene and Bambula. There's the necropolis of Kelariziki, which is an amazing set of tombs, really rich tombs. So we have prehistoric occupation, and then we're getting into the historic periods. When we talk about the late Bronze Age, we have occupation then too. And then we know that Kourion was an Iron Age city kingdom. And so the first mention of Kourion, first written mention of Kourion, is dated to like 673, 672 BCE. It's on a clay prism from Nineveh. And so Kourion is mentioned because the inscription talks about these 10 Cypriot rulers, including Damasos, who's the king of Kourion. And so we know that the king of Kourion sent raw materials to support the rebuilding of the royal palace at Nineveh. And that's the first like textual documented evidence that we have is of this Iron Age city kingdom. So there are remains on the Kourion promontory that we can date to at least the Cypro-Archaic period, which is part of the Iron Age. We have a very early sanctuary of Apollo Hylates, that's Apollo of the woodlands. And at that time, it's an open air sort of altar. And this is like, if you were to visit Kourion, and you're going to take the road up to the site, up to the main city part. This is going to be behind you, right? So if you're facing the Mediterranean Sea, the Temple of Apollo Hylates is going to be behind you, which you can visit today, which is a phenomenal archaeological site. So we know that that was there pretty early. And then we know that there are also Cypro-Hellenistic, this is also part of the Iron Age, there are Cypro-Hellenistic remains on the actual like city part of Cyprus, or Cyprus of Kourion, sorry. And so I call that the city proper. And so the theater that you can go visit today at Kourion, the original theater is actually dated to that Hellenistic period. We also know that during that period, there is an agora or forum, and there's also a reservoir that borders that agora or forum. And so we know that water is immediately an issue for people who are living there, right? So they're building water storage facilities early so that they can support their population.
It is peculiar. It does stand out. I mean, there's no natural water source. I know that, just like you, just like you said, that water sources are important. You look at any major town, historically, there's always a water source nearby. So, do we have any guesses as to what possibly even geostrategic reasons for founding the city on this site? And to add on to that, given that there was no fresh water, how were they able to bring water to the city? Because when you think of bringing water to the city, I think of Roman aqueducts. So, what
Mhm.
was their technological solution to this problem?
Yeah, so these are really good questions. So, why put a city where there's no water? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? And the best answer I can give you is that Kourion is on this line of South Coast cities. So if we wanted to go from east to west, right, we have Salamis and Amethyst, and then you have Kourion, and then you have Paphos. And it's been hypothesized for a long time that shipping routes probably jumped from site to site, right? So you just sort of sail along the coast of Cyprus, you trade your wares, and you get, you can do trading in all of these different cities. And so likely Kourion is just part of that ring around the south coast. So it would have been an important port. The problem is that we've never actually found the Kourion harbor. Many people have tried, and we kind of have an idea of where it would be, but we don't have the archaeological evidence. So we hypothesize that it's there and that Kourion must have been a port city. And based on the finds and things that come from all over the Mediterranean, specifically goods coming from Egypt, we know they're trading, right? And so I think the location of Kourion is actually quite important in terms of that shipping lane. And so that's why you're seeing a city there with no water. Now, the thing is, as you said, the Roman world is absolutely full of water structures, right?
Right.
So I mean, I was in France last summer and was standing on a Roman aqueduct and was like, man, they're everywhere, right? Like
Yeah.
they are just everywhere. And the Romans were just masters of water technologies. And so we are pretty sure we have pretty good archaeological evidence to suggest that there were two water conduits that were set up that brought water from the hills that are just north of Kourion. So this is in the area of Satira, that village that I was talking about before. And so water is being brought down. It's being brought down using aqueducts and conduits, and then it's being brought into the city. And the absolute remarkable thing to me about the water system at Kourion is that not only do we have them bringing in water for life, right, drinking water, but we have an amazing bath complex and an nymphaeum with fountains. And then later on, when they build the big basilica, there are huge water storage cisterns and reservoirs and fountains within the basilica. So they're serious about this water. They're bringing in enough not only to keep the city surviving, to keep it going, keep everybody alive, but also because water in the Roman world is really important and we have to have our fountains, right? So it's Kourion is in a strategic location. So if the environment doesn't support what we want to do, then we change the environment, right? And so they
Mhm.
brought the water in from the hills beyond.
So Kourion is one of the most or more impressive archaeological sites on Cyprus. Again, visiting Cyprus, I'm just speaking from my experience. If you're going to go to any site to see, that's probably one of the major ones you're going to go and check out. It's very
Hmm.
impressive. A lot of Roman archaeological remains there. But
Hmm.
how would Kourion compare in terms of significance in antiquity? Because we know through the written sources, Salamis and Paphos are, typically they're the ones that rank in terms of importance. Do
Hmm.
we know where Kourion kind of fits in on that spectrum?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we know that both Paphos and Salamis were capitals of Cyprus, right? So Paphos, with its big temple to Aphrodite, was once the principal city, and then Salamis is actually refounded as Constantia following those earthquake storms of the 4th century when everything gets destroyed, and then it becomes the new capital. So Kourion never gets the honor of being a capital of Cyprus. But does that mean that it's not an important city? No, absolutely not, right? From all the evidence that we have, it is pretty certain that Kourion, before it was destroyed, and then even after it was rebuilt after the earthquakes, it was a pretty bustling city. We have the temple to Apollo, which was certainly very important, and people came from far and wide to visit it. We have the big theater there. There's baths, there's stuff to do, right? So it was definitely always an important port or trade center, however you want to label it. And it was certainly a stop along that coastal trade route. And so I think it was an important city, but it just wasn't the capital, right? It wasn't Paphos. It
Okay.
wasn't Salamis or Constantia.
So Cyprus has been referred to, especially during the Roman period, as an island in tranquil obscurity.
Yeah.
Not much going on. But this, I mean, this can erroneously imply that it was just this backwater that, faded out of existence, but that's not true. I mean, if you look especially at Kourion, it's a period of large building projects. So how would we say Kourion fared under the Romans? Is it fair to say that this was actually a quite prosperous period?
Yeah, so I love this question. The tranquil obscurity thing to me is so interesting because it's such a top-down perspective, right? This is people looking in from the outside or looking from the present into the past and
Yeah,
saying, well, nothing was really going on.
yeah.
But I would doubt very much that people living during this period on Cyprus felt like they were living in tranquil obscurity, right? So so Kourion was a prosperous city. It was bustling. It had all the things that any other city had, and it had wealth, and it had entertainment, and it had fountains and baths and temples. So is it in tranquil obscurity? No, people are living their lives, right? And I think that looking at the archaeological evidence, particularly stuff that we've dug up from building 4, they're doing okay. It seems really okay. It seems like people are acquiring wealth and building beautiful homes, and other people are running shops and living their lives. So I don't, especially as a person who looks at bottom up processes, I hate this term tranquil obscurity. There's nothing obscure
Mhm.
about Cyprus, right? That's just a big empire looking at a small place saying, "Oh, you're just this little thing on the periphery." Yeah, but not if you're living there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I think Cyprus was doing just fine. It was certainly part of the major Mediterranean trade routes. And as a result, there was lots of interaction and trade. And I'm sure if we were to be able to go back in time and visit a city like Kourion, before the 4th century earthquakes, you'd recognize it as a bustling city.
And that brings us to the fourth century earthquakes.
Mhm.
And this is sort of your bread and butter a little bit, if I'm not mistaken. Before we dive into like the archaeological digs, what do we know about these series of earthquakes according to the sources? And a follow up question to that is kind of a large question. What happened to Korean during this time? I believe it became uninhabited, but I'm sure you can speak to that.
Yeah, so the written sources that we have about the earthquake storms of the 4th century, most of what we know is going to come from Ammianus Marcellinus, who records these earthquake storms. And he talks about how there's just these series of earthquakes that are hitting the Eastern Mediterranean, and some of them are worse than others, and then we have really devastating ones. And so the one that we think hit Cyprus, or just I should say destroyed Kourion, probably happened about 365. And so it was a big one. And it is likely that it actually hit along what's called the Cyprian or the Cyprus arc. And so this is a fault that is between the Eurasian and the African plate. So they're pushing against each other and moving around, right? And then that's what's causing these earthquakes. And so the Cyprian arc actually runs just like south of the south coast of Cyprus. So if you drew a line, if you had a map and a few inches below the coast of Cyprus, you drew a line that ran from like Paphos all the way to the Levant, that's like the Cyprian arc. And so, likely the earthquake that destroyed Kourion hit just kind of like east of Paphos, just south of the coast. And so Kourion got the full force of this earthquake. Okay, so we have a written source that tells us about this, and then we have ample archaeological evidence throughout the south coast of Cyprus that tells us that whether it was in 365 or not, sometime in the mid 4th century, there were these devastating earthquakes. So we know about that. Now, why was this so devastating for Kourion? First of all, the location and the size of the earthquake, but we have to remember that on Cyprus at this time, and even in earlier periods, right? So I work at the early Bronze Age site of Stir Kamenudia, also destroyed by an earthquake. And while the buildings look different in these periods, they're made out of stone, right? Nothing changes over time. People constructed their buildings out of stone, and stone is one of the worst materials to build in for an earthquake zone because it just doesn't give. Wood will shift. Now we have all kinds of fancy construction materials that are used for earthquake zones, but stone doesn't shift easily and doesn't go back into place like wood would, for instance. And so this earthquake hit, and it was big enough and strong enough that it caused the stone walls of these very big, often 2-story buildings to just tumble. And so we see massive, massive collapse. So when I think about the destruction of Kourion, right? The only thing I can the 2 words that stick in my head really strongly is that it was catastrophic and it was complete. Like that was it.
Yeah.
And so the buildings were just leveled. And it is likely, as most people will know who live in earthquake zones, you may get one big earthquake, but you had little tremors leading up, and then you have little tremors following. And sometimes those tremors are not so little, right? You can have really, really big earthquakes after like an initial big one. And so whatever didn't come down in that big earthquake likely came down afterward. And so it was just devastating to this city. So Kourion just lay in ruins. And we know that the population who were able to get out did not go back and look for anyone. And this is actually quite common where in ancient earthquake sites, we don't see people try to retrieve the remains of their loved ones. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One is that shifting stones can do you harm if you're trying to dig through them. I mean, we know that just working at Korea, that these layers of stone are
Yeah.
dangerous.
Yeah.
And the other one is disease. So, decomposing bodies can bring disease. So people often develop like social controls for this, where they see destruction as final and complete, or earthquakes as final and complete, and you don't go back, and then that's considered the final resting place of people. And there's likely a really practical reason for that, and it could have to do with decomp and disease. So people got out and they left, and some people unfortunately did not, and we have their remains still buried under the rubble at Kourion. And so the city was definitely abandoned. We know that they didn't immediately go back and rebuild. And the way that we know that archaeologically is that we look at stratigraphy. So, for anybody listening, stratigraphy is like one of these things that archaeologists talk about all the time, and we think in these terms, but then we say it and then people don't really know what it means, right? So, stratigraphy is this layering in the ground. And so at Kourion, we have buildings, and then we have the destruction layer, and then we have almost like a sterile layer of sand. And so I was saying before that the beach below Kourion, the wind picks up the sand from there and dumps it onto that promontory, and it buries things. It buries us, right? Like we're up there getting
Yeah.
buried in sand too. And so we just have these layers of sand. And so when you see this layer of sand on top of a destruction layer, that has almost no material remains in it, no cultural remains, we consider that sterile, right? No cultural remains equals sterile. And that means that nobody was doing anything there. No people were there for at least a little while. So we see that destruction layer, the sterile layer, nobody's doing anything there. And then what's very, very interesting at Kourion is that when they do come back, when people do come back, they don't rebuild the city as it once was. And they do a very, I want to say it's sloppy, and that's too much of my own judgment, right? But they do kind of they
Yeah.
do kind of a sloppy cleanup where if they know that they're not going to rebuild a building, they take all the debris, all the earthquake debris wherever that was in a space that people want to rebuild. They take that debris and they dump it on the buildings that they're not going to rebuild. So if we think about like from the bottom up, this is our stratigraphy, right? We have the remains of the building, we have the destruction layer, we have the sterile layer, and then we just have garbage. And it is a humongously thick layer of cleanup. So they did come back, they did clean up, they cleaned up parts of the city, not the whole thing, and then they rebuilt, right? And they changed the character of the city. And the biggest thing that people talk about with the rebuilding of the city is that it gets a Christian character, right? You want to put that in quotes, Christian character. And that's because we see the main focus of the city. So just to kind of the south of the Forum and the Agora, which would have been the center before the earthquakes, just to the south of that, you see a gigantic basilica. So we see that Kourion is destroyed, and then when it's rebuilt very differently, and it tells us something about social transformations at this time.
So does this suggest that these earthquakes may have been interpreted as a sort of an omen or a triumph of Christianity that would have brought down pagan temples? Because I mean, Cyprus, we know the fourth century is a period of religious transformations, but we don't have the type of violence like the kind in Alexandria and Hypatia
Mhm.
experienced in Cyprus. What's the archaeological kind of interpretation of this event? Through a
So the
religious lens. Through a religious lens.
right. So I think that this is a question that kind of keeps me up at night, if I'm going to be honest, because I when we talk about religion, we want to almost put an emphasis on these big changes, right? It's as if all of a sudden the whole world is Christian, right? The whole known Roman world is Christian. And I don't think it was as sudden as that. I think that yeah, we don't have the violence that we see elsewhere. That's absolutely true. But I think you just had a dwindling of belief in the old pagan religions, right? Temple of Apollo is already, by the time of the earthquakes, is already going into kind of disrepair. And then, yeah, then we have this catastrophic earthquake, and then we have all these basilicas, right? And Kourion is interesting because we have the giant basilica that's up on that, like the promontory or the cliff, and then there's another church below at the beach
Hmm.
basilica,
Yeah.
and then
Great place to have
we
a church.
oh my gosh, it's so beautiful,
Yeah.
right?
What a
With that
view.
famous I know, and that famous inscription that says, "I'm blinded by the light," right? And you were like, "Yeah, I could see why." It's like unbelievably bright right
Yeah.
here. But and then behind Kourion city proper, we have another basilica that's called the Atmaidan Basilica, right? So we know that like they went a little church building crazy, right? And so that seems to be a giant religious transformation all of a sudden, right? And we had these catastrophic earthquakes. But the older pagan religion was already fading away, and by the time those earthquakes hit, we have evidence of Christianity at Kourion. So do I think, when I think about this, do I think that people all of a sudden were like, well, these earthquakes hit and it's a sign from God and now we're Christian? I don't think that. I mean, I know that there are people that do, and that's totally fine, but I don't think that. I think that the earthquake just became an opportunity to change the city in a way that reflected the major belief system that was happening.
Kourion, it's famous for many archaeological monuments, right? You go there, you check out the House of Astolius and the
Mhm.
early Christian basilica, the one on the promontory, like you mentioned, and then there's obviously the one by the beach. And it's beautiful. There's these fallen
Ugh.
pillars. If anyone listening Google's it, it's really, really picturesque. But
Mhm.
now your work focuses on the earthquake house, which isn't something really noticeable. There's nothing really spectacular about it, at least superficially, right? Can you tell me about the significance of this earthquake house? Like,
Sure,
why
yeah.
is this something that archaeologists have kind of said, "Wow," when they found it?
Okay, so part of what KUSP has done is work in the earthquake house that's kind of followed up on the work of David Soren from the 1980s. Our primary director, Dr. Tom Davis, he worked with David Soren as a graduate student. And so this has always been something that he's interested in. I'll tell you that when in our second and third season, we worked in the earthquake house, and Tom asked me to be in charge of the excavations in there. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't feel like a good enough archaeologist to work at in such a famous building, right? Because to me, the earthquake house was always really like a big deal at Kourion. And so while it's not one of the big monuments, right? The House of Eusebius is later. It's actually built after the earthquakes. It's a really, really interesting building with incredible mosaics and incredible water features. It also gives us some indications of that transition to Christianity that's happening because of the inscriptions and the mosaics, right? And then that early Christian basilica, which, my gosh, like you were saying, it's so picturesque, and you're standing there and you can see this beautiful Mediterranean Sea, and just imagine this amazing, amazing basilica that would have been built around you. But what is the earthquake house, right? It just looks like a building with a bunch of little rooms. Like
Hmm.
it's not the spectacular thing that we see when we go to Kourion, but it's one of the things that you shouldn't miss if you visit it, right? So if you're walking up kind of from where the theater is, right, you're going to cross a road and keep following that path. And on your right hand side, you're going to hit what's called the earthquake house. And so the earthquake house was likely a structure that evolved over time with the changing population of Kourion. And so the overall layout of it is much more like an elite structure, a Roman elite structure, or elite structure from a Roman period, I should say. And but yet now it's got all these divisions of small rooms in it. So it seems like that building was originally built as something else, and then it was turned into, I guess that our equivalent would be an apartment building. And so you have these small rooms that people were living in. And then right next door to the earthquake house, like right up against it, is what we call the market building. So I often think of like the earthquake house as actually like a complex, right? So you have the earthquake house itself and then the market building. And the market building on the ground floor had shops, and then above it people probably lived, not unlike how people live in cities today, right?
That's
It's not
amazing.
that much different. Yeah, which is really cool, right? And so the earthquake house predates the 4th century earthquakes and was definitely destroyed in the 4th century earthquakes, and then it wasn't rebuilt. But one of the cool things that we learned in, I think it was 2014, so we finished the excavation of a room that David Soren and his team had not finished in the 1980s. And then we were very excited to get permission to dig below what would have been considered the floor level. So if you go to Kourion today and you look at the earthquake house, that what you're seeing is what is assumed to be the floor level. Well, it turns out that if you dig deeper, you're going to find more things, and you are going to realize just how much the structure has actually changed over time and with use. And so we dug down in what's called room 11, and we found a giant cistern fed by a pipe. And so this probably was a major water access point for the site. Who even knows? We don't have a date on it yet, but earlier, certainly earlier than the 4th century. Um,
Mhm.
that was one of the more like Indiana Jones moments of my archaeological career because I was digging a
Yeah.
like, this doesn't happen a lot, but I was digging along like the side of what we thought was a wall, and then all of a sudden the sand starts like disappearing from underneath me, and I'm like screaming and jumping out of this excavation unit, and it was because the part of the cistern had collapsed. So had I not been a little more careful, I'm pretty sure I would have ended up in the bottom of that cistern, which is only my worst nightmare as an archaeologist.
Yeah.
But so the earthquake house is really interesting. So we have this water access point that's old. Then we have what we think was probably an elite structure, and then we have the reconfiguration into what I can call an apartment building for regular people. And that's where we had come up with the whole idea that we were going to investigate the non elite structures on Kourion, thinking that the earthquake house was actually part of a non elite neighborhood. Well, P.S., right? Kourion and all her secrets, just across from that, right? You just right over the path from that is now where we're working in building 4, which could not be a more elite structure. So it doesn't seem like that was the non-elite neighborhood that we maybe thought it was.
And what sort of gives that away? Like, what sort of evidence do you look for where you say, okay, this is an elite home and this is not?
Okay, good question. So we look at what people have, right? So if you go into the home of a rich person today and then you go into the home of, say a middle class person, do they have the same kinds of things? No, right? I I don't have what's in the home of Jeff Bezos, right? No way, not even
Yeah.
close. I
Yeah.
don't, right? Here I am on my Dell computer, like really not elite kind of stuff. So we look at the kinds of stuff that people have and what they're using. So, for example, in the earthquake house, we have everyday things and a big, big indicator. So we know that the earthquake house was 2 stories. On the lower story, there was like an area for animals, right? So a donkey was killed in the earthquake when the second floor fell onto the first floor. And he had been chained to what seems like a water trough. And so do you think that you would have animals in an elite home? Most likely no, right?
Mhm.
So it's things like that that are going to be indicators. This the spaces are small, right? Building 4 is a big space and it's not divided in the same kind of way that the earthquake house is. People are living in small rooms. Rich people, elite people don't tend to live on top of shops, right? So we look at those sort of indicators and we can get a pretty good sense of wealth distribution, or sometimes we even talk about calculating Gini coefficients, which we use their stuff to tell us what their likely household income was, right? Not exactly like, oh, they made 40,000 a year, right? But we can get we can produce a scale of rich to poor. And so we use their things to do that.
So one of the most significant and poignant finds was the so-called Romeo and Juliet remains, which I've known as far as I can remember. Having an interest in Cypriot history and Cypriot archaeology. It's one of the images that really stands out. And again, listeners, check out Kourion couple Romeo and Juliet. What do we know about this family? Can you tell listeners about what I'm referring to?
Yes, of course. So Romeo and Juliet are 3 sets of human remains that were excavated in 1934 by John Franklin Daniel. This is some of the initial excavations in the earthquake house, specifically in room 20, if you want to look that up. Um, it is 2 adult individuals and a young child, and they are in a they're lying on their sides, and one adult has their arm over the other adult, and then that second adult has their arm over a young child. And so it is a incredibly powerful image. It I think more so than anything else at Kourion, the human remains speak to how catastrophic and absolutely scary and devastating these earthquakes were for people. And so it is hypothesized that the earthquake, the big one that took out Kourion, happened at night when people were sleeping because of the distribution of human remains. And so other earthquake sites, so like Satira up the road, it is likely that that hit during the day because we have so few human remains within the homes because people were likely out and about and doing things. And so when the walls came crumbling down, they weren't trapped underneath them. But we do have extensive human remains at Kourion. So it's likely people had been sleeping and were caught by surprise and unfortunately died under the weight of the buildings. And so Romeo and Juliet is one group of human remains we've had other remains come out of the earthquake house. The young girl that was found initially, it seemed like she was found lying alongside that donkey that I was talking about, but likely she had been on the second story, and then where we found her is where she fell. um, Building 4 that we work on at KUSP, we found the remains of 4 individuals. So 2 adults, a young child, and a baby. And though their remains are disarticulated and in really fragmentary condition, it appears that they were in a similar protective bundle as the Romeo and Juliet remains. So I'll be honest, I'm not a bioarchaeologist. My specialty is not human remains. It's not something I've ever really been super interested in. But the day that we uncovered the remains in Building 4, I actually had to walk away for a minute because it brought the reality of what happened at Kourion
Mm-hmm.
and how absolutely devastating that moment in time was for these people. It just hit me, right? As archaeologists, we deal with stuff that people left behind and the remains of buildings. And while you don't forget that humans made this and people lived in these spaces, it never becomes more real than when you see something so tragic as this.
Right.
So the Romeo and Juliet remains are really interesting for a lot of reasons. One is that one of the adult individuals is wearing or was wearing a iron ring with the Cairo symbol on it, and that is a symbol of Christianity. So here's another indicator that Christianity was already a thing, right? Was already a strong religious belief and part of people's everyday lives at Kourion before the big basilicas were built.
Well, really well said for that human element, because
Yeah.
I've always tried to make that. I've always tried to articulate that to friends who kind of don't understand my fascination with archaeological sites and
Yeah.
and finds in museums, and why I gravitate to not the artifacts that are not opulent. I like looking at simple things like a cup, right? and
Right.
and or a vase that may have held water. And
Yes.
I gravitate to that because I want to know the human connection. Like, I want to imagine who might have used that vase, or that jug of water, whatever, on a hot day after coming in from laboring in the fields. And what was that conversation like around the table? What did they talk
Right.
about? And to see tragedy, that's I can totally understand and empathize why you would need to walk away.
Mhm.
It's powerful. Often we, including myself, will
Mhm.
go to sites and we just look at the I don't know. Let's just talk about Athens, for example. You look at the Acropolis; it's incredible. It is astounding. What humans can achieve and do. But I'm drawn to the everyday life of just like your
Yes.
everyday laborer.
It's important to me that the human element of Kourion comes out, right? And I'm an anthropologist, right? So I I'm always thinking about what are people doing? Why are they doing it? I'm always watching people, which maybe is a little creepy, right? Like I'm always watching people
Yeah,
even today and like
yeah,
what they're doing and how they're using things. And I've had a lot of people say to me, "Oh, what's your favorite artifact that you've ever dug up?" Right? And they think I'm going to say something like, "Oh, a gold necklace," or we have amazing things at Corian, right? I'm like,
yeah.
those are not my favorite things. My favorite thing I ever dug up was a piece of pottery with somebody's fingerprint in it, right?
That's
Like
awesome.
it's a powerful connection to the past. And I guess one of the things that I always want to really stress with Corian is Corian was a city. And if you landed there, if you yourself, your modern self, landed there right now, could go back in time, you would recognize it, right? Like you could live at Corian. Yeah, you don't have a cell phone and a computer and all those things. But you could do it because it wasn't so different. And I would guess that the human emotion that people felt 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago is about the same as we feel today, right? And we can't forget
Yeah.
that as archaeologists. Very important.
That fingerprint is just like the maker's fingerprint, I'm imagining, right? Like it accidentally just kind of got stuck there.
Yes. So actually fingerprints are not that uncommon on pottery. And so the thing that we were excavating where I saw this was this like flat pan kind of thing that they would put over hearths, right? That's your cooking fire. And they were cooking on top of it. And so it's actually like a kind of pottery that it's very coarse and it's not fired, right? So they shape it and then they put it on this hearth, and then the heat of the hearth is what hardens it over time. And so, they're not trying to make this thing like pretty, it's functional. And so, whomever made it had swiped their finger in the clay and then they didn't smooth it out. And so it was a really phenomenal experience for me because it was my first dig ever. So it's 2001. I'm an undergraduate, right? And I was working. So Dr. Stuart Swinney is the project director for that, but he works very closely with his wife, Lena Swinney, who's also an archaeologist. And she was helping me excavate this hearth and pan because it was like I had no business doing this, right? Like I was like, I don't know how to do this. I'm like brand new archaeologist, and this thing is really friable and
Mhm.
it's hard to excavate and whatever. And so she was helping me, and I was like, I remember saying to her, Lena, what is that? Like the mark in the clay? And she said to me, put your finger in it. And I put my finger in it, and I was like, is this somebody's fingerprint? And she was like, yeah, they swiped their finger along that. And I was like, I need a minute. This is too heavy. Like
Yeah.
it was, and I remember working in that room. This is the first room I've ever excavated. And like having these moments where you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, I am the first person in 4,000 years to be in this room,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, right? Because that site's also destroyed by an earthquake and nobody went back and rebuilt it. And so the sediment filled over it and it was left for time until we came along, right?
Yeah.
So, what a powerful, amazing moment to connect with like human history and all the thousands and millions of people who have come before you.
Now, you said you weren't a bioarchaeologist, but you
Mm-mm.
you use osteobiography, I think, as one of your tools. What is osteobiography exactly, and what did you
Sure.
learn about the families or other individuals that you've excavated at Kourion?
We were very fortunate at Kourion to work for a few years with Dr. Anna Osterholz, who's at Mississippi State University, and she is a bioarchaeologist. And this is her work primarily. And osteobiography has to do with looking at the lives of one or the life of one individual. In archaeology in general, we take a sample and we extrapolate that larger, right? Well, we have this many potsherds. It tells us something about what's going on at this in this room? How do we what do we do with that then? Is it just about what's going on in that room, or do we want to extrapolate it larger to a bigger population? And sometimes that's useful and we want to do that. But in the excavation and analysis of certain of the individuals that have been dug up at Kourion, who've been excavated at Kourion, we don't necessarily want to do that. Maybe we just want to know about the life of that individual. And so in the 1980s, working in the earthquake house, David Soren's team had found the remains of one individual, and they didn't have the time to do a proper excavation and analysis. And so they block lifted it, which means that they just took that individual and everything that was around them, dug that out of the ground, and then they encased that in plaster to then be analyzed and properly excavated later. And so Dr. Osterholz worked on the excavation of that individual and then the analysis. And so she came up with such interesting information about this individual's life. So we know it was a male between the ages of 27 and 30. We know that they had fairly good health as a child, but they did experience episodes of food and water restriction. We know that at the time of death, that there were fractures to the ribs, the upper arms and the shoulders, the head and the face, and that is all really in line with how he was found underneath the rubble of the building, the tumbled stones. So he had been crushed. Interesting, he was also found in that fetal position, lying on his side. Um, and this is another moment where you really live the trauma of that earthquake. So he had his left arm shielding the top of his head and his right arm covering his right ear and the side of his head. So, trying to protect his head from the falling stones. And so, could we extrapolate this larger and talk about the trauma of earthquakes, and maybe we could do further analysis on other individual remains and find out about this nutritional stress that was going on, this periods of restriction of food and water? Yeah, we could, but we haven't yet. So what we did was an osteobiography of this individual. And again, I want to stress, like, this is Dr. Osterholtz's work. Like, this
Okay.
is amazing stuff. So
Is there any way you can distinguish between someone lying in a defensive position versus
Mhm.
sleeping? And that question only comes to mind because I always assumed that the Romeo and Juliet remains, if we go back to Kourion, I always assumed that that was a defensive position, like that.
Yeah,
But if I'm reading you right, it was likely they were asleep when
they
that.
could have been.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell, right? Have you ever been in an earthquake?
I have once, and it was in Cyprus, my first and only time,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
and I hope never again.
So I've been in a couple of earthquakes, really small ones. So where I grew up on Long Island, there's actually like a fault that runs right through Long Island, but it's not a very active one.
Yeah,
And so it was an earthquake as a kid. And then we had an earthquake when I lived in Albany. And then we had one here in Phoenix. And all three of those times, I was like, we just had an earthquake. And people are like, no, we didn't. It was a truck. Right. Like, that is like always like, and I'm like, no, I'm telling you it was an earthquake. But last summer, I was in an earthquake in Cyprus, a really little tremor, but it hit early in the morning. There's a little bit of a warning, right? Earthquakes sort of build. And like, in my mind, whether this is true or not, I don't know. But in my mind, there's a sound. Like, stuff starts to shake and it makes a noise. And I think it wakes people up. But you don't have enough time from that moment to the full impact of the earthquake waves to get out of wherever you are necessarily. And so I often wonder if, like the Romeo and Juliet group, right? If they were lying in bed but had the didn't have enough time to get out, but had enough time to grab hold of each other. Do you know
yeah,
what I mean?
yeah,
So certainly the individual that I was talking about that Anna Osterholz analyzed, that guy was found like on the floor of a shop. There's something called ring keys, and so it's a ring that goes on your finger, but it's actually like a key to a box or a door or whatever. They're actually really cool. And so we have a bunch of these from Kourion, and he had one in his hand. I don't know if he was wearing it or it
Yeah,
was just in his
I feel
hand.
like I read this in one of the
Did you
papers.
read it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And so is it could he have reacted really quickly? Could he have been awake and ran down into the shop to get out? And that's why he had the ring on, or the key with him, right? I don't know. But he doesn't seem to have been like necessarily like in a sleeping position. Right. It was like he was in a prone position, right? That fetal position, but he had moved his arms to protect his head. And the same thing with the four individuals that we found in building 4. We found them in the corner of the excavation unit. And so I always want to say we found them in the corner of the room, but I don't actually think we did. I think that I'm just confused about where the edge of the room is. But they were they were huddled together, and I'm not sure that they had been sleeping. Like did they have enough time to move? But
Yeah.
certainly the way that the young children are placed sort of underneath the two adults, that seems very protective. So I think you have like both things going on. And it's hard to like kind of separate them out because remember, this moment in time was fast, right? This is the thing. Earthquake archaeology, any kind of natural disaster archaeology is weird because, like, think of Pompeii, right?
Mhm.
Like, this is like moments in time and they're not long. So, in archaeology, we talk about thousands of years at a time, like it's, 1 minute. But the truth is, this is 1 minute. Like,
Yeah.
how do you separate out those just seconds while this was happening? So I don't know. I think that the Romeo and Juliet one really seems to me like they had been asleep, but certainly not the other individual and not the group from Building 4.
Now,
So I don't
I
know.
don't know if you said this, but just for clarity, that house, the
Mhm.
earthquake house, it was not rebuilt, right? I mean,
It was not
yeah,
rebuilt. Yes.
I would find it a
Yep.
little bizarre that it was rebuilt and the bodies were there and
Yeah.
no one noticed.
Yeah, yeah, people go
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, exactly, right? It's a little creepy in a way. But, yeah, Building 4 and the earthquake house were not rebuilt. It almost seems like that part of the site was likely abandoned. So, like, if you go to Kourion, right, and you stand by the earthquake house and you look towards the sea, you're gonna look right at our excavation. But you look at this, like this field that's pretty unexcavated, and i I don't have a lot of evidence to support this right now, but I think that that part of the city was largely abandoned from what we found.
Okay.
And so I guess I do have some evidence to suggest that, but it seems like that's not where the rebuilding took place, which is not unusual. It seems like it was the dumping area,
Yeah.
and then they cleaned out the forum, the agora, right? And they cleared the area where the basilica was later put, and the area where Eustolius is built, and what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of something else. Anyway, that area seems to all have gone back into use, but not necessarily where.
Out of curiosity, I didn't ask
Mhm.
you this question, but I'll ask you it now. I know that for the remains of Romeo and Juliet, they are, I think, on display at the Kourion Museum. What do archaeologists typically do with the other remains that are excavated? Are they sometimes reburied or are they placed elsewhere?
Yeah, so in Cyprus right now, there isn't a mandate to rebury human remains. In the United States, we have NAGPRA, right? Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And so when we are uncovering human remains, the local tribe or the tribe that claims ancestry to these individuals will come after excavation and analysis, and we will repatriate the remains to them, and they often rebury them ceremonially, right? So they treat their ancestors with reverence,
Hmm.
and they rebury them. We don't have that law in Cyprus. We don't have the same kind of tracing of ancestry. So, in most cases with human remains, and what we've done with the human remains from Kourion is that they are carefully packaged and they are stored in the local museum. So the human remains that have been excavated by KUSP are in the Episcopi Museum in the storerooms.
Okay.
So it's actually it's really unusual now to put human remains on display in general.
Yeah, yeah. I
So
mean, I
yeah,
asked that question with indigenous archaeology in mind,
yeah,
because being in Canada, uh,
yes, yeah,
First Nations, Inuit, Métis, it's at the
yep,
there's very important conversations happening right now, and I do know that that's one of the things that, as you mentioned, archaeologists do in tandem with the nations that happen to be on that part of land and so forth. We're entering the 12th year of CUSP, right?
yes,
So,
yeah.
which, congrats. It's huge. And
Thank you. Yeah.
what sort of it's a pretty big question here, but I mean, since 2012 and now, what discoveries have been made? What conclusions have you drawn?
Oh boy. So here's my big conclusion. Earthquake archaeology is hard. so
Yeah.
so Kourion is a very difficult site to excavate. Wading through the tumbled stones of very big buildings, two-story buildings, this incredible amount of stone. It is difficult. And so as we're moving forward, we are really trying to understand that stratigraphy and really be able to identify well the destruction layer and that period of nothing going on at Kourion, that sterile layer. And so I know that that doesn't sound like the super exciting discovery that like maybe other other people could list, but to me, the understanding of that stratigraphy and then that um, the contribution to disaster archaeology is really, really important. Um, but so if we want to talk about material remains, right? What discoveries have we had since 2012? Okay, well, we have now uncovered at least 3 new structures at Kourion. So we worked in the earthquake house that everybody knew was there. And now we found building 4. There's a building next to building 4. And then there's at least one more building right on the cliff down by the sea. And then we also have found a water structure that's also down on the edge of that cliff. And then we are pretty sure that people were utilizing the bedrock as almost like alleys or roads or streets. And so we know that that area of Cyprus, right, has limestone bedrock and it's really uneven and it has these big divots in it. And sometimes just like the, the the bedrock will be really level and then just sort of dip down and you're like where to go, right? And so one of the things that they were doing was filling in those empty spaces, those divots or those holes in the bedrock to even it all out, and then they plaster over it so that you have this nice walking space. So we see how they're kind of maneuvering around the environment. And so that alone in terms of like structures has been really fun to learn about Kourion. That whole area that from the earthquake house down to the edge of the cliff and the sea, that had never been investigated before. And so now we know that that space was full of structures and movement during the life of the city. So that's been a big discovery. Um, Building 4 has turned up things that I never thought I would excavate as a archaeologist. Um, Beautiful marble sheets on the walls, right? So stone walls that are covered in these imported marble sheets that are just gleaming white and beautiful. Porphyry, which is a purplish stone that comes from Egypt, was lining the walls and the floor, and we have statues, and we have glass plates that were imported from Egypt and only made in one part of Egypt, and through an amazing technology of grouping canes of glass together and fusing them to make beautiful designs that look like flowers. So we have things like that, right? And then we have remnants of one of the only cage cups that have ever been found in the world. And so if you don't know what a cage cup is, look this up. They are amazing. So they were made during this period, and it's basically like glass that was and carved so you have a cup, and then they carve out the glass to make sort of this cage design all around it. And so these are extremely rare, probably not because there were so few made, but because they're so delicate, and we have the remains of one. And so we don't
Wow.
have the whole
Is that on
thing.
display by any chance at the museum there?
Oh, that's a good question. It might be now. I think it might be, yeah. And so, but definitely the Wikipedia page on cage cups is really cool. I look at it when I'm bored, right? Because it's just amazing. They're just
It's
amazing.
funny
And so
as you're talking about it, that's literally what I'm looking at
did you
right
look
now.
it up? So ours is like a greenish color and a clear, and it is spectacular. It is really incredible.
And
And so
you also were you there for the discovery of the marble statue of the boy with the gosling?
yes. Oh, I sure was.
Oh
So
wow. Oh wow.
so we've had several or fragments of statues come up. And last summer, so this was in 2022. Last summer, we just kept finding like these random things like hands and feet and statue bases, and more so than we've ever found before. And then we found the statue of the little boy. And so we're very, very lucky because Dr. Charles Stewart was working with us last summer, and he is an expert in Roman art, and so and architecture, and so he immediately like sprung into action as soon as we found the statue of the boy. And so the statue is made out of marble. It is, I guess it's smaller than life size, but like if you were thinking of a small child, it's not far off. It's pretty big. This statue, it is missing a hand and a leg, right? It is not complete, but it is mostly intact. It's a nude male child holding a gosling or a duckling, and so Dr. Charles Stewart has done some work on, finding equivalents for this statue, right? And this is actually like a copy of other statues, and it wasn't
Mhm.
uncommon in the Roman world during this
Yeah,
period.
it's a familiar
And
motif.
so yes, and so it's like this chubby little boy, right? I always call him the fat baby. And so he's got kind of a little smile, and he has this wavy hair, and part of his hair is pulled into a top knot, which is also called an Apollo knot. And
Mhm.
so Dr. Charles Stewart has determined that this is a Harpocrates Apollo statue. So during this period, we have this melding, and even previous periods, we have this melding of different gods from different cultures. And so this is like the joining of Apollo and Horus as a child, which is really super interesting. And so we found his shoulder first, and the person that found it was like, "Oh, Laura, come over and look. I don't know what this is." And I was like, "It's a rock," right? Like it looked like just a rock. And then she's uncovering it. I'm like, "Oh, this is serious now, right? This is something serious." And so, I would say that maybe not for me, but for many people that work on this project, this was one of the most exciting finds we've ever had. And the care with which this was excavated, actually, Tom Davis excavated it himself, and the care of like almost exhuming, right, this little boy was incredible. And so Chris Davy had determined that he was probably put up like against a pillar, so you didn't really see his back, and tumbled off of the pillar during the earthquake and landed forehead down on the floor in this room. And so, if you see pictures of him, he's got this patch on his forehead, which I had assumed was damage. And then our conservator, who was fantastic, Noelle Seaver, she said it's not damage; that's actually the color of the marble. And so that's preserved because it was face down on the floor. So it is really phenomenal. The Cyprus Mail did a story on it, so if you look it up, you can see the picture of it. Um, I was just amazed at how we had to transport it. I mean, it got carried like a baby, like very precious cargo, and then the Department of Antiquities curators packaged it up in a wooden box that they made for it and with foam all around it, and we have all these photographs of them taking it out of the museum, and I was like, wow, I never thought that I would ever be a part of a find like
What do we know about
so.
the actual location? I mean, I know you said it was on a pillar, but
Yeah.
what was the building?
Okay, so we found this in building 4, which is that elite structure, and it was in the room that is furthest to like the south. What direction is that? Southeast. Um, we're not really sure of the overall configuration of this building just yet. It is huge. We've not excavated the whole thing. Um, for a long time, we've called the area that it was found in the courtyard because it seemed like it had been more of like an open space. That is not certain, right? That was kind of like a working hypothesis. And so, what is interesting is that the majority of the other sculptures that we have found have been in that area too. So something was happening in that room with sculpture, right? So in my mind, I imagine it as like sculptures along the perimeter of that room, possibly, other ones up against pillars. Um, that may be more fantasy than reality, but that's how I have to imagine it in my mind right now until we have further evidence. But so it fits right in with everything else that's been found in this room. As you may or may not know, there's no marble on Cyprus, so all of it has to be imported. This is
Hmm.
certainly an import. Um, and actually, one of the things that Charles Stewart talked about is that these statues of Harpocrates Apollo, they're copies of an original, and they're probably mass produced, which I find amazing. And so, the original probably dates back to like the Hellenistic period. The original is gone, but we see Roman period copies. There's even one, I think there's one in the Louvre, there's one in the Vatican. And can you imagine, like, you dig up something that's also in the Vatican? That's like mind
Yeah,
blowing, right?
yeah.
And so this little guy who's so important to us, right, and is like the find of like a lifetime for many people, is mass produced, right? Like there were many of these, but they're not available to everybody. So they're definitely decorating elite residences. And so it fits in line with all of the other stuff that we're seeing in building 4.
Are we any closer to finding the non-elite residences? I know that's been a huge focus of yours, hasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, of mine, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, are we any closer? No, we're further away. No, but you know what I think? We have a lot of work to do in understanding this building 4, especially over time. And so last summer, I mean, I work with really brilliant people, and every day I'm thankful for that. And so last summer, Chris Davy and Charles Stewart and Ian Randall, who does our ceramics, they were having this conversation about how, like, in looking at the way that the walls are in the building, that it's likely that this building was also reconfigured, and they're coming around to this idea that maybe in the last phases of the use life of this building, it wasn't so elite. And that is a really interesting prospect. It is so this is going back to the stratigraphy issue. this is something that we have to sit down and just go level by level by level and understand the stratigraphy to see if we can piece out the different the different stages of life of the building. The problem is with all that garbage dumped on top from the cleanup of the city, it gets a little bit squirrely, and so it's going to take a lot of work. But that's our next big goal, is to really understand how what the building originally looked like and how it changed over time, and who was living in it when the earthquake hit. So, if I were we're in the last stages of excavation at Kourion now. Um, but if we were to continue the project, so this is like, I'm throwing this out to anybody who might ever be interested in working there, and I'll help you. But if anybody were ever interested, a really awesome research question would be to find those non-elite residences and to get off that Kourion promontory to find them and to get back in
Mm.
that hillside and see if they're back there.
Hmm.
'Cause I think probably that's where they are.
Would it be fair to imagine Kourion, the archaeological site there, as sort of analogous to downtown? Like where the people living there are
Yeah.
living in their condos, really high, like really expensive property. You have a lot of cool things to do, the equivalent of, Madison Square Garden, right? You go to the amphitheater, right? Is that a fair kind of parallel to draw?
I think it is, and that in my head is how I have to imagine it to understand what's going on in that city. And so anybody that's listening, right, go to Kourion, right, and stand there and look out onto the Mediterranean Sea and realize that that view has not changed very much over time, right? You have a direct line of sight to the sea because the buildings aren't standing for the most part, right? So there would have been buildings obstructing your view a bit. But do you think that non-elite people get that view,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, to me, like you're going to put those elite households in the city proper. And I think of it just as you described, right? I grew up in New York and going into New York City, Manhattan all the time as a kid. And regular people don't live in Manhattan. They live in Queens, right? Or they
Yeah, they
live
live on Long
in New
Island, right?
Jersey or Long Island or the Bronx, right? You live where I grew up, right? So we don't get that view. And so that's another reason why I think like the city proper is where the life of the city is happening. You go to the theater performances, and let me also stress that every year there are performances still in the Kourion Theater, and they are phenomenal. It is so what an experience to see a play in an ancient theater, right? So you're going to the theater and you're going to the agora and and later on you're going to the basilica. This is not for everybody, right? This is for those elite members and people coming into the city, and regular people are probably more involved in the support of the city, as in bringing in the agricultural products from the hinterland. So again, like I really think like the non-elite residences are along the periphery of the city proper, and the people living in that city with that view next to the theater, like these are
Mhm.
your elites in the city. Yeah.
Did you suggest earlier? I'm just kind of circling back to Apollo Hylatus. Did you
Sure.
suggest earlier that if we were to find non-elite residences, it would be in and
Mhm.
around the sanctuary area?
Yeah, you have the sanctuary and the theater and at Maidan, which is that basilica, and like in that area behind there. So if you go around Kourion, right, instead of turning down the road that brings you to the site, if you keep going on that main road, you're going to go up on top of the cliff, and but you're like behind Kourion City. And if you were to like look to your right, that's where I think that you're going to find the non-elite
Yeah,
structures.
and I guess it's incredibly difficult to pin these down, only because I think of like my mom's house, her like familial home that she grew up in. in Cyprus. It's been my dad and my mom. They tore down the original structure and they built another one over it. But
Yeah.
the original home was like mud brick. You know, it was,
Yeah. Yep.
and I can't imagine that technology being that much different. You know, 2,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago,
Yes.
and what sort of remains can you expect to find? It's got to be really difficult. Like,
Good question. So I'm a prehistorian, so this is like my bread and butter, right?
right,
So the prehistoric houses on Cyprus, which are not that different from what you're describing, the traditional houses of Cyprus, their foundations are usually stone. So you have a few courses of stone, and if it's not stone built all the way up, then it's mud brick on the top, right? Or kind of like an adobe, right? And so what do you find? Okay, in really specific circumstances, you will find mud brick preserved. Mud brick will melt because of, rain and the elements, but it's obvious that it's mud brick, right? So you get this blob, but it's obviously had once been a structure. So I've worked in the American Southwest where they work in adobe, and and they carve out from the ground like a hard it's like, what's it called? It's like I can't say the word. It's like a calcium buildup,
okay,
right? And
yeah.
that's the
I don't know the
foundation
word
of
either, but let's go with it.
I can't get it right now. But caliche, that's the word. I got
Okay.
it. So they carve out from the caliche this like hard calcium buildup, and then that's the foundation, and then you have the adobe on the top, right? And so the adobe melts, but it is so obviously had once been a wall, and you get these sort of lumps in the ground that are unnatural, and that's how you know you're looking at a structure. And so what would we find if we found non-elite structures at Kourion? I think we would find something similar to what we find prehistorically, which is going to be that like stone foundation at the very minimum. And then if they were using mud brick, then we'd find the mud brick melt. The key, right, is the scatter of artifacts. So it's not just the architecture, but what are we finding grouped together, right? So if you're finding household goods grouped together, pottery and tools for processing food, and in this period, you're even going to find like furniture kind of things and tables, right? We have that from the earthquake house. Once you find that stuff grouped together, the likelihood that you're inside a structure is really high. So even if the walls are gone, you know what you have.
Typically, how far deep do are you digging before you hit? Because you're talking about the stratigraphy, and I'm just thinking about like the
Yeah.
layer upon layer upon layer of
Yeah.
dirt and sand and overgrowth that have
Oh,
accumulated over the
yes.
centuries. I mean, are you digging like 6 feet? I mean, that seems like unreasonable to me, but I mean, maybe it's not
Yeah.
that
So
unreasonable.
no. So at Corian, actually, it's funny because the way that we found Building 4 is that it looked like a hill, and I think forever everybody just thought it was a hill, and then, Chris Davey was looking at it one day, and he was like, "That's not a hill, it's not natural," right? And so, because of the size of the buildings, you don't actually have to go very deep to get to the top of them. Well, we started Building 4, and maybe not even that intentionally, we wound up on the perimeter of it. And so it was kind of like the downslope of the accumulation. So we didn't go very far at all. Um, as the middle of the building, we have a very high deposit, and so we've been working diligently to get down through that. That's several meters actually, but it's several meters of mostly cultural debris that's from the cleanup of Kourion. So it varies, and the building that we found that's next to Building 4 was actually quite deep and is meters and meters. We had the tops of the walls pretty quickly, but to go down the whole side of the wall, like we spent a long time. So Cyprus is funny in how, I guess maybe everywhere is, but the deposition can really, really vary. And that also has to do with the height of the bedrock underneath. So if you have high bedrock, the chances you don't have a big accumulation on the top of it, and you don't have to go very far to get to what you want. But I would say at Kourion, the tops of our walls are not that far under the present surface, right? Because I'm going on about this, but
Oh no, please
while
do.
you have these, yeah, like I find formation processes really interesting. I know it bores some other people, but you have this process of deposition, right? So the sand is dropping onto the top of the Kourion promontory, and sand is not great for the formation of soil, right? Sand is a sediment. Soil is that mixture of sediment and organic materials. Organic materials break down really slowly on Cyprus because it's a drier climate, right? And it's hot. And so we have very little topsoil, right? That's how we would think about it. We have very little topsoil, this little bit of plant debris on top, which is mostly dead by the time we get there in May, right? It's all like crunchy and brown. And then once you get under that, you get the sand deposit and then the cleanup of Kourion stuff and everything we talked about already. But um, because we don't get that really big organic layer that you see in some other places, um, or the depth of the remains can be pretty shallow.
Okay.
So at at the early Bronze Age site that I work at, that's just up the road from Kourion, we have remains that are just under the surface, but then we have at the same site, we have buildings that are meters down, right? And it has to there's so much going on, right? The earth is constantly moving and it's depositing and water's flowing and we have earthquakes, so things are shifting. And so it depends. I that was a very long answer to say to you, it depends.
No, that's okay. I actually have one last question. I'm sorry. This probably went
Sure.
beyond what you expected for
No,
recording.
no, I'm loving this. Andreas was really nervous about this, but this has been such a great experience. So
Great. Thank you. Again, this is it's kind of off topic here, but I remember driving
yeah.
into Kourion, and there's this like rock face side of the, I don't know what it is, but there's holes in the rock, and I feel like in some places, if my memory serves me right, there's like iron bars that kind of block off these entrances. And I've
Yes.
always wondered, like,
Yeah.
what was excavated there? Why is that closed now?
That's a cemetery. So that is the Amethyst Gate Cemetery that was excavated by Dr. Danielle Parks and her team. And so, yeah, when you come up the road, right? So you turn off the main road and then you're coming up the road to the gate of Kourion, right? So that's the Amethyst Gate. That was one of the original entrances to the city. Right on your right hand side. So we have the cliff face, right? So Cyprus is uplifted from the sea. That's how it forms. And so we have these limestone cliffs, and they're all kind of pockmarked, right? Because that used to be the ocean floor. And then, yeah, and then if you look at that cliff, you're going to see openings, like you said, with the iron bars. And then if you stop your car, you can do this as long as you have good boots on and probably pants and water. And if you stop your car there and walk into that area, you'll see that there's kind of a bedrock shelf on the ground. And there are these holes cut into it that are generally like a squarish shape. That's a cemetery. And so Dr. Danielle Parks and her team excavated the human remains and the grave goods from that cemetery. So the reason that you see the iron bars on some of them is because they don't want people going in and getting hurt, right? Because animals will go in there and live. Bats and other birds will also go in there and live, and then their excrement can cause respiratory problems. So it's just safer to,
Okay.
not have people go into those.
I've seen the
Cemetery
movie
was
Contagion, so I
yeah, you know what happens, right? And so, yeah, you don't want to mess around with that kind of
yeah.
stuff. So, that was one of the cemeteries. Actually, the publication of the work done there is coming out soon. Really tragically, Dr. Danielle Parks passed at a young age, and the project was given to Dr. Michael Given, who has done a fabulous, fabulous job of assembling a really expert team to go through the notebooks and the materials that were excavated from that cemetery, and the publication of all that will be coming out very soon. So keep an eye out for that if you're interested. But yeah, that's a cemetery, and you can go and you can go look and see the remains of the grave. So tombs are usually rock cut in Cyprus in I was going to say the prehistoric periods, in the ancient periods, and so you can see the cutout of the bedrock and of the cliff faces.
That's so cool. And now
Really
that
interesting.
obviously would have been, I mean, I say obviously, but maybe it's not true. Elites that would have been buried there as opposed to the commoner.
I don't know the answer to that,
Yeah.
and I guess maybe I better read that in the upcoming publication. But I would assume so.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
would assume
I would
so too.
assume they're pretty elite
Um,
burials. Yeah.
when and why was Kourion finally abandoned?
So Kourion gets rebuilt after the earthquake at a like smaller scale, and it is a city for all intents and purposes until the time of the Arab raids, and then that is the final abandonment of Kourion. I'm
Yeah,
pretty
that's what I,
sure.
I figured it was the Arab raids.
I think
I
that's
knew it was
right.
the Arab raids,
I'm
and
pretty sure.
I
Right, that's the end of like
it.
most of those.
I wonder if finally, I guess the Arab raids were the 7th century around there. I wonder if finally they
Yeah.
were just like, let's find somewhere with water. you know?
No, and you know what? Kourion, in a lot of ways, is a costly city to maintain, right? These water systems are fragile. Our water system today is fragile, right? How many times have we all heard about a water main break and then nobody has any water, or some kind of cross contamination happens with a sewer line, right? And then we have all kinds of problems like that. And so it's a lot of maintenance when you could maybe just move where you live, right?
Hmm.
So I think that you're right, and we also have to keep in mind that climatically, Cyprus is prone to droughts, and I know that in like the late Byzantine period, we we see extended droughts for Cyprus, and so it it's not worth the cost anymore to try to get the water to the city, right? And I think I am very interested in the water system of Kourion, and that's just like my own personal thing. But I think there's a lot to learn about why the city is there, how it existed over time, and then why it's finally abandoned. And like your answer could come from that water
Yeah.
system. It had to be so important. It had to be,
Yeah.
right?
A
You
hundred
can't have a
percent.
city without water. Yeah, so yeah,
This was awesome.
thank you so much.
Eh,
This is great. I don't know, I had so much fun.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Andres, thank you for finding me. This was a pleasure. I was very nervous, but it's just been so lovely to talk to you.